Chapter 13 will focus on Congress. So, the learning objectives will be to contrast congressional and parliamentary systems, trace the evolution of Congress in American politics, discuss who serves in Congress and what influences their votes, summarize the organization of Congress, explain how a bill becomes a law, and discuss possibilities for congressional reform. So, the two types of legislature we see in practically every liberal democracy today is either that it's a Congress or a parliament. In a Congress, the legislature is separated from the executive. The representatives are independent, although they do have party loyalties. The most important thing to them is, being loyal to their constituents, not to the party per se. There's also a primary system where voters choose among individual candidates. Their principal work is representation and action, and they're paid and staffed relatively well. In Parliament, the legislature determines the executive, known as the Prime Minister. The members of the Parliament are loyal to the National Party leadership and the PM. The voters choose among parties rather than persons, largely, and the principal work is debate on party issues. The leadership takes action rather than the backbenchers. So, historically, the legislative branch has been pretty important, obviously. It was the dominant branch of Great Britain, our former colonial overlord. It was the only branch in the Articles of Confederation, and it was the key branch in the early state constitutions. It's also the first and longest article in the U.S. Constitution. James Madison referred it to as the first branch of government. This was the framers' view of Congress. It would hold most national government powers. It was essential to federalism with the Senate. It maintained separation of powers, and it's the linchpin of checks and balances. So these are the duties as prescribed by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to borrow money, to regulate commerce of foreign nations among states, to establish rules for naturalization and bankruptcy, to coin money, set its value, and punish counterfeiting, to fix the standard of weights and measures, to establish a post office and post roads, to issue patents and copyrights to inventors and authors. As you might have imagined, a lot of these were pretty important in early colonial America, especially to fix the standard of weights and measures and to coin money. Considering the fact that during the days of the Articles of Confederation, each state could print their own money and have their own standard of weights and measures, making communication between the states practically impossible. You also have these other duties: to create courts inferior to the Supreme Court, to define, punish piracy, felonies on high seas, and crimes against law of nations, to declare war, to raise and support an army and navy, make rules for their governance. This was done in order to ensure that the United States would have actually a proper military force to enforce its laws, unlike under the days of the Articles of Confederation, where a centralized federal military seat did not even exist. To provide for a militia, to exercise exclusive legislative powers over seat of government, federal facilities, to make, and probably one of the most important ones, the enumerated powers clause, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all of the powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. However, let's just say, contemporary Americans' view of Congress is not very good. Most Americans view it as the broken branch of government, and they find it unable to address problems effectively. They think it's too responsive to special interests. There's nonstop They believe there's so much nonstop campaign funding and/or corruption. It is unlikely to fix itself. It's also very unpopular. It's not helped by the fact that, people expect a lot out of the congressional representatives, and when they fail to deliver, they're pretty pissed. You also have computer-aided partisanship, lobbying, judicial reviews, you have basically, all these things just, clobber together to make Congress's job a lot more difficult. Partisanship especially with gerrymandering, lobbying, judicial reviews, which can basically destroy, which can basically override anything Congress passes. So a very powerful presidency, international, and the pressure of international opinion in the United Nations and the Geneva Convention. So as we can see, the approval of Congress has steadily decreased over time. It reached an apex in the wake of September 11 attacks, and it rapidly declined to where it is today, where it is in the 20s. Now, one of the reasons. Now, here's some reasons why Congress is bicameral. Why it has two houses. Part of it is just traditional. Parliament. The British Parliament has the House of Commons and the House of Lords. There's also state precedents. Only that Nebraska today is unicameral. It also is just for practical reasons. Bicameralism was needed to implement the Great Connecticut Compromise, with states equally represented in the Senate and proportional representation in the House of Representatives. It's also due to theoretical reasons. There was a desire to put extra checks on power in what was expected to be the predominant branch of power, and we pour, as one quote put it, we pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. Each Congress meets for 2-year terms. This is mostly just because of the way House of Representative elections work and how Senate elections work. With the House of Representatives, each representative being voted once every 2 years, and the senators who have 6-year terms, their elections are staggered. The 116th Congress began in January 2019. Until World War II, Congress only met 4 to 5 months per year. Now it is year-round with a few recesses. Since Congress now meets virtually all year, there are just 2 sessions for each term. For the same reason, there are almost no special sessions. So the history of the House of Representatives can be roughly divided into 6 phases. Powerful House, divided House, Speaker rules, House revolts, members rule, and the leadership returns. So you may be wondering, who is in Congress? It's certainly not representative average Americans. They're almost always rich, educated, and white males, but it's becoming less so. Over time, you have less lawyers and ex-military and more business individuals. You had the first woman speaker with Nancy Pelosi in 2007. However, the Senate, because of its nature, is changing much more slowly than the House. The Senate was resented as a millionaires club, and the 17th Amendment, which called for the, I believe that the direct election of senators didn't change this. So this is this is a nice little map of who's representative of Congress. Now this might be a little bit out of date because I think this shows when the Republicans in majority. So, right now, as of this video, the Democrats have a majority in the House and the Republicans have a majority in the Senate. But as we can see, the House and both of the Senate are overwhelmingly old and men and also white. So yeah. Now, most incumbents win if they run. The re-election rate for incumbents is 93% for the House, 82% for the Senate. The incumbency advantage has grown to 6 to 8 points over the past few years. Incumbents have the advantage due to the fact they have a lot of money, a campaign war chest, as well. They also have name recognition, seniority value, and constituent services. For example, a representative might say, well, you see, I got that fancy new factory that, I was the one who went to Congress and got you that fancy schmancy nice factory that's employing all you people. That's that kind of stuff. So, as we can see, the re-election rates for House and the Senate have, remained very high for decades. Roughly 60 to 80% of House of Representatives districts are safe. Basically, the winner wins by 20 points or more. Senate districts, i.e. states, are somewhat less safe than representative House districts because it's the entire state that's voting. There are fewer and fewer marginal districts where the race is close and competitive. So, Democrats controlled both houses of Congress 65% of the time between 1933 and 2015. Between 1968 and 1992, Republicans' popular vote share was greater than their share of seats. This was mostly due to gerrymandering on the part of the Democrats, and so the Republicans decided to get revenge on the Democrats by focusing on gaining state power to run the gerrymandering. Now, it's the Democrats who are suffering, who are now suffering from popular vote, a discrepancy between their popular vote share and their seat and the share of seats. Now, the bigger deal when it comes to polarization in Congress is the big sort. Republicans and the Democrats are like sorting themselves into certain geographic areas. In this case, the Republicans are more evenly spread in the suburbs and the rural areas, while the Democrats are clumping up in the coast and the big cities. So the Democrats, quote unquote, waste more votes because in the big cities they get Democrats overwhelmingly win, but because they're so concentrated and because of gerrymandering, the districts aren't like, They basically, it's like one district for that one entire city, essentially. Now, you do get major electoral convulsions and waves occasionally rearranging things. You had cross-party conservative coalition emerging in the 60s and the 70s, then declined when the Southern Democrats went with Nixon's race baiting to the Republican Party. You have, like I said, a growing ideological partisanship and purity. Now, the upside is there is a clearer choice now between parties, because in the past, the Democratic Party had both relatively liberal wings and other factions that were extremely racist. So it's like, if you were a Democrat voter, you didn't have to be like confused about the nuances of the Democratic Party. Now, the size of the House has been fixed by Congress at 435 for the past 100 years. If it was as representative today as it was 1789, we would actually have 10,000 representatives. After each 10-year census, seats are reapportioned or redistributed between the states based on population. Each state gets at least one representative. 7 low-population states do. Now, the flight to the Sunbelt states like Florida and Texas and immigration has moved power away from the Northeast and the Midwest since the Second World War. Washington, D.C., by the way, has no voting representation in the House, even though it can now vote for president, as decreed by the 23rd Amendment. In the House, all members are up for election every 2 years. This is meant to keep the representatives close to their constituents. The House was supposed to be seen as the people's house, kind of like the House of Commons in a way. It was originally not expected to be a long-term career. There are no term limits, despite there being a lot of push for it. So the qualifications for the House of Representatives is you need to be 25 years old, citizen for 70 years, but you don't need to be a natural-born citizen, which is different from running for president. You have to be inhabitant of the state. Now, informally, you can also live, you can live in his or her district. You can sleep. You're able to sleep in hotels, and raise lots of money. So some of the informal qualifications, are that you have to live in your district, be able to sleep in hotels because you'll be traveling all around a lot, and you also need to be able to raise a lot of money because these elections get really expensive. So this is an example of our current voting district. As you can see, it is horribly gerrymandered. Basically, this entire block votes Republican, and what they've done is that they've gerrymandered so that the more left-wing elements of Cincinnati would get drowned out by the more right-wing suburbs and this mostly rural county. The Senate is viewed as, the upper house. Roughly 1/3 of senators are former House members. It is designed to have a longer term and a much more mature view. It was like the House of Lords, a place for ideas to cool. So each state gets 2 senators, regardless of population. It's also very undemocratic and unamenable and inconsequential because you get white and rural states way overrepresented. Basically, this is a nice little chart provided by the New York Times. Basically, white people get a lot more senators per million of their own kind compared to minorities. This is just another example of the major discrepancy. Wyoming has the same number of senators as, say, California, despite the fact California is much bigger than Wyoming. Now, senators represent the entire state, so they have a broader constituency than most congresspersons. They were originally selected by state legislatures. However, the Progressive Era 17th Amendment changes this to a direct election. They get 6-year staggered terms, and 1/3 of them are up for election every 2 years. There are also no term limits, by the way. You have to be at least 30 years old and citizen for 9 years and a resident of the state in order to be run for senator. So this is a nice little, comparison between the House and the Senate. You can pause the video if you wish. Now, the compensation is very generous. They are usually paid. Congress people, representatives, and senators are usually paid in the range of $174K to $227K. They also get very generous fringe benefits and allowances and deductions. They also They also get their mail. They also can mail, campaign literature to their voters, with congressional money. They also get an incumbency campaign war chest, roughly $100,000 each. Now, members vote the way members of Congress vote can vary between these three views. The representational view argues that members vote to please their constituents. The organizational view argues that members vote to please fellow members of Congress. And the attitudinal view argues that members vote on the basis of their own beliefs. Now, in reality, representatives and senators vote along all three lines. The other way to chop it is the delegate approach, acting as a mere agent of constituents' desires. The trustee approach, use their own conscience and judgment to decide. The partisan approach, follow the party line. Or the political approach, combine all three of these. Now, in Parliament, party organizations dominate Parliament. That's a fact. However, in Congress, it's a lot more complicated. So, in the Senate, you have several leadership positions. You have the President pro tempore, which is just a honorific title, usually reserved for the most senior senator. They usually fill in when the vice president, the president of the Senate, is not there. The majority leader, who has the real power, schedules business, and the minority leader leads the opposition. You also have whips, who keep nose counts and try to apply party discipline by herding the party members along party lines and leading the rank and file. You also have policy committees, with a dozen or so senators for each party advising on priorities. You have an 18-member Republican steering committee and 22-member Democratic committee on committees, selecting who gets on to the all-important standing committees. These are the permanent committees. Now, with the House, it's a bit different. Because the House is so big, more leadership and more rules are required. I'm just checking something. Oh, shoot. More leadership and more rules are required. Speaker of the House is a real leader. The majority leader or the floor leader is the second in command and their heir apparent. You also have a minority leader, whips, committees, and both chambers having campaign committees to raise money. So this is a nice little, leadership diagram of Congress. So if you just want to know who are our leaders, Mitch McConnell is the current Senate Majority Leader, while Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. Now, most members of Congress vote with their party most of the time. This, however, not as reliably as it was 100 years ago, and not as uniformly as in Parliament. Increasing ideological purity has reduced civility and the spirit of bipartisanship. There's always the risk of getting screwed over by a more radical person in the primaries, and Congress has basically become has become basically a four-letter word. Now, congressional caucuses are starting to rival parties as a source of policy leadership. These are basically association of members of Congress created to advocate a political ideology or to advocate advance a regional, ethnic, or economic interest. There were 4 in 1959, yet there were 70 plus by the early 1980s. These guys usually negotiate party leadership. Examples. You have the Democratic Study Group, which is mostly liberals. The Freedom Caucus, which is the Tea Party radicals. The Blue Dog Democrats, who are the centrist Democrats, and the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, in Congress, there are roughly 24 committees and 100 subcommittees. This is where the real work of Congress gets done. There's great competition to get the plum assignments on the most powerful committees. The seniority system is being replaced by merit, sort of. The standing committees are like, permanent / key commit the most key committees. Select committees are temporary. Joint committees are where both chambers are involved. Conference committees are a special type of select / joint committee, which irons out differences between Senate and House versions of bills. And the chairman and the chairpersons, chairwomen, or chairs are powerful, but they have been reined in a bit recently. So this is basically like, just like a little rundown of some of the leaders in 116th Congress. Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House. Representative Hoyer is Majority Leader. Representative Clyburn is the Majority Whip. Representative McCarthy is the Minority Whip, and Representative Scalise is the Minority Whip. So this is just like a little portrait of some of the leaders of the current House. This was like, what it was like in 112th Congress of the House. This is like, I know like he's still. This was the GOP Senate leadership for the 115th Congress. The current one, is the one is the 116th. This was the U.S. Senate leadership for the 115th Congress. Senate leadership in the 112th Congress, that sort of stuff. So if you want to know what all the permanent committees of Congress, this is the list. There's a lot, and these are basically where all the meat of the legislative process takes place. So this was basically the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. So each representative has 16 to 10 assistants, and each senator has 36. Their responsibilities include constituent problem solving, reelection, legislative functions, and ironing out differences. Staff agencies which serve all of Congress include the Congressional Research Office, the Government Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office. Basically, the CBO scores a bill on cost/benefit. So Congress provides insight, often via hearings. They also propose and pass measures, bills which become statutes if they pass, and resolutions as well as being resolutions which can range from time-wasting declarations of post office names to critical acts. Now, resolutions can be simple, establishing operating rules in each chamber, concurrent housekeeping for both chambers making declarations of sentiment. However, these do not have the force of a law. A joint resolution is when a legislative measure which requires the approval of both chambers and is submitted just as a bill to the president for possible signature into law. The joint resolution is usually used for continuing appropriations when budget process break down, 90% of the time, or emergency appropriations. Joint resolutions and not bills are also used to propose constitutional amendments. These resolutions require 2/3 affirmative vote in each house but are not submitted to the president. They become effective when ratified by 3/4 of the states. So it's a little rundown of the types of bills and resolutions. So most bill proposals come from the executive branch. Many others originate with special interests, basically lobbyists. Some come from congressional standing committees, some are stimulated by Supreme Court decisions, and some are based on the news and developments and events, like the coronavirus stimulus bills right now. Most bills get pigeonholed or killed in committee. Occasionally, the whole House can blast out a bill stuck in committee via discharge petition. Lyndon Baines Johnson threatened to do this in order to get the Civil Rights Act passed because he knew the committee that was overseeing it was dominated by white Southern racists. For bills the committee does choose to consider, they're assigned to a subcommittee. where you get debates, hearings, and horse trading, and the process can get pretty ugly. That's why it's often called the sausage-making process. Bills are often amended, sometimes with pork barrel riders to ease their passage. Riders are unpopular ideas that pass because they are attached to a popular bill. If bills get out of committee, they usually are approved by the full House after a complex dance with the powerful Rules Committee. Now, no bill can get a floor vote without approval by the Rules Committee. Earmarks and pork are overlapping but not synonymous terms. Roughly speaking, pork is about content, by definition wasteful and usually in someone else's district, while earmarks are about process. They're usually nefarious, hidden, at least in the current usage. In 2006, there were 13,000 earmarks costing $64 billion. These were hidden in conference reports, not subject to amendment. If you're wondering where the term pigeonhole comes from, by the way, this is basically a desk, and this is where a pigeonhole was. They just stick the piece of unwanted legislature in there and just let it sit out to die. So on the floor, there are rigid rules about how long anyone can speak. Some bills are designated closed or restrictive rule, where there's little bit debate. Others are open rule. You also get a final reading and usually electronic voting. So as we can see, very few measures get passed. Most of them die, usually in the committees. So now, with the Senate, things are a bit different. The Senate thinks of itself as the world's greatest deliberative body. There are much fewer members in the House than the House, so much more time for debate, including the ability to talk to death by the increasingly used filibuster. Filibusters protect the minority party and let passions cool, but they can also cause a lot of gridlock. Strom Thurmond, a Dixiecrat, basically a sovereign Democrat, held up a Civil Rights Act via a 24-hour quote-unquote speech. Rand Paul recently filibustered to call attention to drone killings. This is funny. Ted Cruz read green eggs and ham for a day to hold off a spending bill. That's hilarious. Today it takes 60 votes or 60% to end a filibuster via cloture. Filibuster and cloture are not laws. They are just the Senate's self-chosen rules and customs. Now, the nuclear option calls for doing away with the 60-vote cloture rule, but both parties want it when they are in the minority. Now, the nuclear option has been invoked for approval of all appointments, including Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. It has not been invoked in legislation, and Republicans try to use a trick called a budget reconciliation to eliminate cloture rule for repeal and replace Obamacare, but this limited their options to make big changes. Note that per the Constitution, 2/3 majority is still needed for the Senate to approve a treaty. Now, the trick is to get around this is executive agreement, but that can be revoked by the next president. After a law or whatever has been passed in both houses of Congress, you get a conference or a joint committee to harmonize the two versions of the bills. Then you also get a revote on the final version and a sent to the president if approved by both houses and chambers. The president can sign it into law or do nothing, and it becomes law in 10 sessions days, or they can veto it, which can be overridden with 2/3 of both houses, or pocket vetoing, basically doing nothing if Congress adjourns in 10 days or less, or increasingly sign, but also add signing statements. Signing statements involve statements by presidents that they believe some part of the legislation is unconstitutional, and therefore they intend to ignore it or to implement it in only ways they believe is constitutional. Some critics argue that the proper presidential action is either to veto the legislation or to faithfully execute the laws. So this is basically a rundown on the House and the Senate. Due to the high number of passive steps, it is very easy for a measure to get killed. Now, basically, if you want to know how a veto bill becomes a law, law relay race, basically, it can get vetoed and then overridden, and then So there were some other non-legislative powers like oversight hearings, especially the McCarthy hearings, and as well as the backlash to McCarthy. The famous line, "Have you no decency, sir?" Watergate, Iran Contra, and the Russian meddling and collusion cases. Now, there are proposals to reform Congress, due to these problems, gridlock and the lack of compromise due to the increased polarization. You also have an undemocratic Senate. California gets the same number of senators as Wyoming. You have awfully gerrymandered House of Representatives seats. The filibuster frustrates the majority. Attention is constantly diverted to campaigning and fundraising. You also get a revolving door to industry, where senators and Congress people, once they leave, they can reliably go to like a lobbyist job. You also have professional politicians who have no term limits with incumbency privilege. They also have abdicated power to the president. The president nowadays can take a lot of actions on military matters without approval of Congress, like sending troops here for a police action and such. The Congress is still overwhelmingly cis, or basically heterosexual, Protestant, white, lawyer, and male. You also get often a very mixed government relative to the executive branch's party. Basically, you can have a Republican president and a Democrat Congress, a Republican Congress and a Democrat president, which can cause all sorts of headaches. There's also no concern for the future posterity, debt issues as well as global warming. The lack of action on that is pretty appalling, if you ask me. Seniority is still overprivileged over talent and merit. So yeah, fun stuff. Let's hope any of you viewers are able to tackle and resolve some of these problems, because it's not good when you have a very important branch faltering so terribly. And that will be all.